Legend 8 of Old Testament Legends by M.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Legend 8, Ahikar. In the book of Tobit in the Apocrypha, you will find mention in several places of a man called Ahikar, who was a relation of Tobit. In the first chapter, verses 21-22, you read that he was a great officer at the court of King Esarhaddon, and at the end of the book, 14:10, you may learn something about his story. For Tobit says to his son Tobias, "Remember, my son, how Ammon handled Ahikar, that brought him up, how out of light he brought him into darkness, and how he rewarded him again. Yet Ahikar was saved, but the other had his reward, for he went down into darkness." Then it goes on, "Manasseh gave alms and escaped the snare that was set for him, but Ammon fell into the snare and perished." Now, of late years, the book has come to light which tells the whole history of Ahikar, or Ahikar as we shall call him, and you will see as you go on that in the book of Tobit some mistakes have been made in the names, and that instead of Ammon we shall have to read Nadan, and instead of Manasseh, Ahikar. This is the story of Ahikar. He is made to tell it himself, and he says, "When I was a young man, I was steward to the great king Esarhaddon, the king of Nineveh. I was rich and had great estates and beautiful palaces. I had everything that my heart desired, except one thing, and that was a son. I had no child to comfort me and to inherit my great possessions after me. Many times did I go to the temples of the gods of Nineveh and offer them sacrifices and gifts and burn incense before them, and I said, 'O gods, give me a son, that I may enjoy his company while I live, and when I die he may close my eyes and bury me. And verily I am so rich that if every day from the day of my death until he died he were to take a bushel of my money and cast it away, he would not come to the end of it before his death.' But the gods of Nineveh made me no answer. Then I bethought me of the God of Israel, of whom I had learned when I was a child, for I came out of the land of the Hebrews, and I turned to him and besought him in like manner that he would grant me a son. And a voice came to me, saying, 'Forasmuch as thou hast put thy trust in false gods, and sacrificed to them, thou shalt have no son. Yet this do, take thy sister's son Nadan, who is a young child, and bring him up as thine own son.' So I took Nadan and gave him to 8 nurses to bring him up. He was fed on all manner of dainties, he was clothed in purple and scarlet, and slept on the softest beds. He grew up like a fair young cedar tree, and I instructed him in all my wisdom until I was 60 years old. One day the king Esarhaddon returned from journeying through his kingdom, and sent for me, and said, 'Ahikar, my friend, my faithful and wise counselor, you are becoming an old man. If you die, who shall succeed you and serve me in your place?' I answered, 'O king, live forever. There is with me the son of my sister, whom I have brought up as my own son, and have instructed him in all the ways of wisdom.' The king said, 'Go, bring him before me, and if I take pleasure in him, he shall serve me in your stead, and you can have rest from your labors, and joy and honor in your old age.' So I brought Nadan to the king, and when the king saw him, he delighted in him, and said, 'The gods preserve you, my son.' And to me he said, 'As you have served me and my father Sennacherib, so shall this youth serve me, and I will honor him and promote him for your sake.' And I gave thanks to the king, and we went out, I and Nadan, from his presence. And I took Nadan home, and spoke to him in private, telling him how he should conduct himself, and of what men he ought to beware, and whom he should trust. All these precepts are written in the book of Ahikar, but they are not put down here. Now I hoped that Nadan would pay heed to my words of instruction, but when the king had exalted him and taken him to live at the palace with him, I was grieved to see that Nadan began to become wasteful and unruly, and that if I had suffered him, he would have squandered my money and ill-treated my servants. I admonished him, therefore, but it was in vain. He said, 'My uncle Ahikar is getting old and timorous. His wisdom is failing him. One need not pay much heed to what he says.' And by degrees I saw that the king began to believe Nadan, and that he no longer received me with such honor as in the old days, and this was a grief to me. Now, as I no longer had Nadan to live with me, I considered and took his younger brother Nabuzardan into my house. But when Nadan heard of this, he was very angry, for he thought, "Is this old man going to leave all his possessions to my younger brother and turn me out?" So he began to think and plot how he might put me out of the way, and himself gain favor with the king. And at last he sat down and wrote certain letters. In the first he deceitfully imitated my handwriting and sealed it with my seal. It was written in my name to the king of Persia, saying, "From Ahikar, scribe and treasurer, to Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, greeting. As soon as thou hast received this letter, set forth with thine host, and come to the plain of the south on the 25th day of this month, and I will guide thee to Nineveh, and thou shalt take the city and possess the kingdom without any strife or battle." This letter he left lying in my chamber in the palace. The other was written to me in the king's name and sealed with his seal. To Ahikar from Esarhaddon a greeting. As soon as thou receivest this letter, assemble the army and go to the plain of the south on the 25th day of this month. And when thou shalt see me, range the troops as if for battle, and come quickly towards me. For I have the ambassadors of the king of Egypt with me, and I desire that they should see the might of my army. This letter Nadan sent to me, and I began to make preparations as it commanded me. Thereafter Nadan took the first letter, feigning to have found it in my chamber, and brought it to the king Esarhaddon. And when the king had read it, he was very angry, and said, "O ye gods, what have I done to Ahikar, that he should seek to betray me thus?" Nadan said, "Perhaps, my lord, it is a forgery. Be not too soon disturbed. Let us wait till the day appointed, and then go to the plain of the south. If Ahikar is not there, we shall know that the letter is not his. But if he is there, and armed men with him, I fear that he must indeed be conspiring against thee." And the king consented. On the 25th day of the month, therefore, the king and Nadan set forth and rode out to the plain of the south. And I, as I had been commanded, was there with the great army which I had gathered. And so soon as I saw the king and his train approaching, I drew up the soldiers in battle array and marched quickly towards him, and the soldiers waved their weapons and shouted, and there was a great noise. Then the king was very sorely troubled, for he was sure that I had rebelled against him. But Nadan said, "Go back, my lord king, to the palace. I will capture that evil old man and bring him before you." And the king departed with his servants. But Nadan rode up to me and said, "All that you have done is right and well performed. The king is greatly pleased with you, and desires that you will send away the soldiers to their homes, and come before him alone to receive your reward." So we rode into the city, and he brought me into the palace, where the king was seated on his throne, and all his servants about him. And I perceived that the king was in displeasure, but I knew not why. Then he put into my hand the letter which was written in my name to the king of Persia, and said, "Read that letter." And when I had read it, my knees knocked against each other, and I was speechless. I sought for a word of wisdom, but I found none. Nadan cried aloud, "O wicked and foolish old man, come forth from the presence of the king, stretch out thy hands for the cords and thy feet for the fetters." And they bound me. Then the king Esarhaddon turned away his face from me, and spoke to Nabushemak, the chief of the executioners, who had been my friend, and said, "Take Ahikar, smite off his head, and remove it 100 ells from his body." And I fell on my face and said, "O king, live forever. It is thy will to slay me, yet I know that I have not sinned against thee. Now, my lord, I beseech thee, command that I may be slain before the door of my own house, and that my body may be given to my wife to be buried." And the king gave commandment accordingly. Now, as they were taking me to my house, I sent a messenger before me to my wife Ashvani, who was a very wise woman. And she, when she heard what had happened, did not waste time in making lamentation, but hastened and prepared refreshment for Nabushemak and for the slaves that were his helpers. She came forth to meet them, and accompanied them into the house, and set food and wine before them. And the slaves drank of the wine till they were drunken, and fell into a deep sleep, every one in his place. Then I said to Nabushemak, "Do you remember how, when the father of the king delivered you to me to be put to death, I spared you, because I knew that you had not done that for which you were condemned? And how, when the king learned that you were guiltless, he took you into favor again, and rewarded me? Now I swear to you that I likewise have not conspired against King Esarhaddon, but I have been falsely accused. Save me, therefore. But lest the rumor should be spread abroad that I have not been put to death, do this. I have a prisoner in my house who is condemned justly to death. Take my clothes and put them upon him, and smite off his head. Behold, your servants are drunken and will perceive nothing, and I will be in hiding until the day when the truth is made known." And Nabushemak was glad, for he was my friend, and agreed. And it was done as I advised. The slaves took the prisoner, and smote off his head, perceiving nothing, and gave his body to be buried instead of me. And it was published throughout all Nineveh and Assyria that Ahikar was dead. Then Nabushemak and my wife Ashphani made a hiding place in the ground. It was 4 cubits long, and 3 broad, and 5 in height, and it was covered with a stone. There they hid me, and gave me bread and water to eat secretly, and there I abode many days. But Esarhaddon was grieved in spirit, and said to Nadan, "Go to the house of Ahikar, and celebrate his funeral, for he was thy uncle, and served me and my father faithfully for a long time." So Nadan came to my house, but he did not celebrate my funeral. He gathered together strange men and women, and feasted with them, and sang and drank, and was drunken. He mocked at my wife Ashphani, and as for my servants, who loved me and had been long in my house, he stripped them and beat them and ill-treated them, until I heard the voice of their weeping and crying in my hiding place, and I prayed the Most High to deliver us, and to reward Nadan according to his works. 2. Now when Pharaoh king of Egypt heard that I, Ahikar, was dead, he was very glad, for he had always stood in awe of my wisdom. And he wrote a letter to Esarhaddon in these words: "Pharaoh king of Egypt, to Esarhaddon king of Assyria, greeting. I desire to build a castle between heaven and earth. Send me therefore a wise man to whom I may commit the business. If he accomplishes all that I require, and answers all my questions, I will send you by his hands the whole revenue of Egypt for 3 years. But if you cannot send me such a man, then you must send to me by my messenger the whole revenue of Assyria for 3 years. And if not, I shall come against you, and lay your land desolate. And so, farewell." When the letter was read before Esarhaddon, he called together his princes and counselors and wise men, and said to them, "Which of you will go to Egypt and answer the questions of Pharaoh?" They said, "Lord and King, in the time of your father, it was Ahikar the scribe who answered all hard questions, and solved all difficulties. And behold, now you have with you his sister's son Nadan, who has been instructed in his wisdom, and can do all that you require." So the king turned to Nadan and said, "Will you go to Egypt and answer Pharaoh?" But Nadan said, "It is folly. The gods themselves could not build a castle between heaven and earth. How then should the children of men accomplish such a thing?" When the king heard that, he arose and came down from his throne, and threw himself on the ground, lamenting, and saying, "Alas, alas, I am undone! I have slain my servant Ahikar at the word of a foolish boy, and there is none like him left. Who can give him back to me?" Then Nabushemak spoke and said, "O king, live forever. He that disobeys the commandments of his master is worthy of death. Say therefore the word, and let them hang me on a tree. For Ahikar, whom you bade me slay, is not dead, but living." The king said, "O Nabushemak, if it be as you say, and if you can show me Ahikar alive, I will give you 10,000 talents of gold, and 100 robes of purple. Say on, therefore." Nabushemak said, "One thing I ask of my lord, that he will not keep this my trespass in mind, nor store up wrath against me." And the king sware to him. Nabushemak went forth immediately and mounted his chariot, and drove swiftly to my house. He uncovered the hiding place and brought me forth, and took me up into his chariot, and led me into the presence of the king. And when the king saw me, he wept, for I was in evil plight. My hair was grown over my shoulders, and my beard reached down to my girdle. My body was foul with dirt, and my nails were as long as eagle's claws. My eyes were dim from the darkness, and my limbs were stiff so that I could scarcely walk. And the king said, "O Ahikar, it is not I that have brought this misery upon you, but he whom you have brought up as your own son." I answered, "O king, since my eyes have looked upon you, I have no more sorrow or pain." The king said, "Go to your house, bathe your body, and cut your hair. Refresh yourself, and take your rest for 40 days, then come back to me." And I did so. But after 20 days I had recovered my strength, and I went back to the king. Then he showed me the letter of the king of Egypt, saying, "Behold, Ahikar, the burden which they would lay upon me and upon my kingdom." And I answered, "O king, live forever. Trouble not yourself, nor be disquieted about this matter. I will go to Egypt and answer the hard questions, and I will bring back to you the revenues of Egypt for 3 years." So the king was comforted, and he rejoiced greatly, and made a feast and gave me rich presents. Immediately after this I began to make ready for my journey, and first I ordered my huntsmen to catch 2 young eagles alive. I also chose from among my servants 2 young boys, whose names were Nabuchal and Tabshalom, and taught them to ride upon the backs of the eagles, and after a while the eagles became accustomed to bear them up in the air. I also taught them certain words which they should say at the appointed time, and practiced them until they knew perfectly what they had to do. And when all was prepared, I set forth with a great company and went to Egypt. It was told Pharaoh that an embassy was come from Nineveh, and he sent for me, and when I appeared before him, he asked who I was, and I answered, "I am Abikam, one of the least of the servants of Esarhaddon." Pharaoh was displeased and said, "Am I then so much despised by your master that he sends me the least of his servants?" I said, "My lord Esarhaddon is so far exalted above his servants that in his sight the great and the small are all alike." He said, "Depart from my presence, and tomorrow come again to me." Then Pharaoh, who desired foolishly to make himself appear great in our eyes, arrayed himself in purple, and made his nobles put on scarlet and stand about him. And when I came into his presence, he asked me to what I compared him. I said, "My lord, you are like the god Bel, and your nobles are like his priests." And in like manner on the following days he dressed himself in various colors, and each day asked me what I should liken him to. And I said, "To the sun on one day, and to the moon on the next, and on the third day to the spring and the flowers of it." And he was greatly pleased, and said, "Abikam, you have compared me to the god Bel, and to the sun and the moon and the spring. Now tell me, to what do you liken your master Esarhaddon?" And I said, "I cannot tell you, O king, until you have risen from your throne." So Pharaoh stood up, and I said, "My lord Esarhaddon is like the great God of heaven in respect of you. He has dominion over the god Bel. He can forbid the sun to shine and the moon to rise, and he can lay waste the spring and all the flowers thereof." Then Pharaoh was displeased, and said, "I adjure you, by the life of your lord Esarhaddon, tell me what is your name in very deed." And I answered, "I am Ahikar the scribe, and the seal of Esarhaddon is in my keeping." Pharaoh was troubled when he learned that I was yet alive, and he sent me away, saying, "Tomorrow come to me and tell me a thing which neither I nor my nobles have ever heard." So I took thought and wrote in the name of Pharaoh a bond in which it was said that he owed to my lord Esarhaddon 900 talents of gold. And next day I brought it before Pharaoh, but before I had opened it, the nobles cried out, saying, "We know it of old, we know it well." Then said I, "Why, thank you for acknowledging the debt." And I gave the paper to the king, and he looked on it and said to them, "What? "Do you acknowledge that I owe 900 talents of gold to Esarhaddon?" And they were confounded, and cried out again, No, we have never heard of any such thing. So I said, If it be so, I have done what you required. But Pharaoh said, It is enough. I have sent for you to build me a castle between the earth and the heavens, even 1,000 cubits above the earth. Come forth into the plain tomorrow and accomplish this. And I said, Well, O king, and do you, for your part, bring masons and that which is necessary for building. So on the morrow a great multitude assembled to see how the matter would go. But I had my eagles and my boys in readiness, and when Pharaoh gave the word, I sent them up, the boys riding on the eagles. And when they were high up in the air, the boys called out, as I had taught them, Bring us mortar, lime, and stones, we are ready to begin the building. And the masons and all the people were amazed, gaping at the boys. And I fell upon the masons and beat them, saying, Why delay you? Make haste, give them what they ask for, and such like words, till they fled before me. And I said to Pharaoh, If your people refuse to do their part, how can I do mine? And Pharaoh and his nobles murmured, but they could not think of any answer. So Pharaoh said, It is enough. Leave the matter of the castle. I have other questions to ask you. On the morrow he called for me and said, I saw a great pillar built of 8,763 bricks, and about it are planted 12 cedars, and each has 30 branches, and on each branch are a black and a white mouse which gnaw it. I laughed and made answer, O king, there is not a child in the land of Assyria who could not interpret this riddle. The pillar is the year, the bricks are the hours, the cedars the months, their branches the days, and the black and white mice are the night and the day. Pharaoh's face fell, and he said, Well, but now I command you to plait me a rope out of the sand. I answered, Let them bring me a pattern out of your storehouse, O king, that I may have it to copy. And he said, You trifle with me, and unless you plait me such a rope, I will not pay you the revenues of Egypt. I went aside, therefore, and considered, and knowing that the Egyptians were foolish, I thought upon a plan. I got a mass of sand and put it in a chest, and made it run out through 2 pipes, so that when the sun shone upon it, it appeared like the strands of a rope. And I called to the king, Let your servants plait together the 2 strands of the rope which I have made, and when they have done so, I will make more. And again they were dismayed, and could say nothing. Lastly, Pharaoh showed me a millstone which was broken in 2 pieces, and said, Come, Ahikar, sew this together for me. But I took a small piece of a like stone, and said, O king, I have not my tools with me, but command your shoemaker to cut me a thread out of this piece of stone, and I will sew the millstone together forthwith. Then Pharaoh laughed and said, Well, Ahikar, it was on a good day for your lord that you were born. Come, I will make you a feast, and after that you shall return to your own land. So after certain days I departed, taking with me the revenues of Egypt for 3 years, and also the 900 talents which I had made Pharaoh acknowledge that he owed to my lord. And Esarhaddon came forth to meet me, and when he heard what I had done, he made me sit down on his right hand, and said, Ahikar, ask what thou wilt, and I will give it thee. And then I said, O king, live forever. 2 things only will I require of thee. One, that thou wouldst do good unto Nebuchadnezzar, for it is by his means that I was saved alive. And the other, that thou wouldst give me power over my sister's son Nadan, and not require his life at my hand. And the king granted my request, and exalted Nebuchadnezzar to the first rank in his kingdom. But Nadan he delivered into my hand. I took Nadan to the hall of my house, and set him with his feet in the stocks, and a collar of iron about his neck, and iron bands upon his hands. I fed him with bread and water, and chastised him with rods. And when I came in or out of my house, I stood and reproached him, speaking in parables and proverbs. Now these are some of the parables which I spake to Nadan. My son, thou art like one that shot an arrow into the heaven to slay God. The arrow fell back upon him and pierced him. Thou art like one that saw his neighbor shivering with cold, and took a vessel of cold water and poured it over him. Thou didst think to take my place after my death, but know that even if the tail of the pig grew 7 cubits long, no man would mistake the pig for a horse. Thou art like the trap that was set on a dunghill. The sparrow saw it and said, Brother, what dost thou here? The trap answered, I am fasting and praying. The sparrow said, And what is that piece of wood by thee? The trap said, My staff upon which I lean when I pray. And what is that in thy mouth? It is a little food for hungry wayfarers. Then said the sparrow, I am hungry and a wayfarer. Come hither then, said the trap, and fear nothing. But when the sparrow came, the trap caught it by the head, and the sparrow said, If these be thy fastings and prayers, God will not accept thy fasting, nor hearken to thy prayer. Thou art like the pig that went to the bath along with the nobles, and when it had bathed and come forth, it saw a pool of mud, and went and rolled therein. Hearken, a serpent was sleeping on a thorn bush, and a flood came and swept them both away. And a wolf saw them floating on the water, and said, There goes one evil upon another evil, and a third evil carrying them off. The serpent said, And dost thou bring back the kids and lambs to their mothers? Nay, said the wolf. The serpent said, I know not whether there is much to choose betwixt us. Thou art like the mole that came up out of the ground to curse God, because he had not given to it sharpness of sight, and the eagle saw it and carried it off. When men say to the wolf, Get away from the flock, he saith, Nay, but the dust thereof is healing to mine eyes. When they took him to the school, the teacher said, Say A. The wolf said, Lamb. Say B. He answered, Kid. Surely he spake of that which was in his thoughts. At last, after many days, Nadan besought me, saying, Have mercy on me, spare my life, and I will feed thy swine and keep thine asses, and be thy slave forever. And I said, Thou art like the palm tree which bare no dates, and the owner came to cut it down. And it said, Leave me this 1 year, and next year I will bear melons. But he said, Thou that hast not borne thine own fruit, how wilt thou bear one that is not thine? Now, behold, I will say no more to thee, O Nadan, but let God, who preserved me alive, judge between thee and me. And forthwith judgment went forth against Nadan, and his body swelled up and burst, and he died. For it is written, He that diggeth a pit for another shall fall into the midst of it himself. End of Legend 8. End of Old Testament legends, being stories out of some of the less known apocryphal books of the Old Testament by M.R. James.